Our second reading this morning is from Paul's letter to the church in Rome, in the 13th chapter of that letter, beginning with the 11th verse. Actually, I'm going to back up and start with the 8th verse. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Besides this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone. The day is near. So then let us lay aside the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. May God add a blessing to this reading of the Word. Oops, I didn't collect all my toys. As many of you already know, because I made a big deal of it and I promised to stop talking about it soon, my basement flooded last week, 2 weeks ago. And the truth of the matter is that was not really the beginning of the problem. The beginning of the problem goes back about 30 years ago, when Carol and I started living together and never figured out how really to throw anything away. And it's just been getting worse over the years, so there's a lot of stuff in the basement that doesn't belong in the basement. And there's something, I don't know about you, but for me, it's like when there is something big in front of me, I don't know where to start. And when I don't know where to start, I don't. It's like an anxiety reaction or, a frustration reaction, but it's just like, I don't know where to start, so I'm going to think about something else, something small, something more fun, something easier to accomplish. And then that great, big, scary, anxiety-producing thing continues to simply be there. And somehow I think it's going to somehow take care of itself. And so it just gets worse and worse. So it was not just a matter of all the stuff we've been accumulating for 30 years. It's like other things, too. And our house was not the place we wanted for it to be. Like our living room carpets. They are 10 years old now. They were not well installed. But that company went out of business, and that's water over the dam. But the fact is that they were getting all wrinkled. And they needed to be cleaned. Only they probably needed to be replaced. Only, where were we going to come up with the money to replace them? So they probably ought to be cleaned, but they're not going to get cleaned until they get stretched. But what's the point in spending the money on stretching then and cleaning it, if it's still going to look, so for years it just went on. Nothing happened with those carpets, nothing, because it was just too big a problem. There was no place to start, so we did nothing. And then 2 weeks ago, our basement flooded. And we had to figure out what was the first step. So we called the people who fixed the sump pump, which was the original problem. And then we called the people who suck water out of basements. And they came and sucked the water out of a basement and out of the carpet in the basement. And then the next thing is that carpet had to be restretched and put back in the basement room, right? So while those guys were here, we asked them to give us an estimate for stretching the carpet in the living room. And they came, and the estimate was actually quite reasonable. And they said, we could do this before we leave. And they did. And then they handed us a card. This is a really good company for cleaning carpets. So while they were still in the house, I called that company, and they're coming on Thursday. And we took away 2 pickup trucks full of trash that got ruined by the water. It was all stuff that should have been thrown away anyway, whether it was soaked with water or not. And then while Carol was busy, because there's this thing about momentum. Once you get started on something, then the next step, once you find the first step, the next step seems much clearer to you. So she just got her friend to come over, and they sorted through a bunch of stuff that wasn't ruined by the water, and we took an entire pickup truck full of stuff to Goodwill. And things are on their way. The second floor, of course, we had to move everything out for the carpet stretchers to stretch, and so we dusted everything and vacuumed everything and cleaned everything and threw away a bunch of more stuff that was on the other floor. And it's like there was a certain kind of momentum. But the fact is that when you have a big, frightening, anxiety-producing thing before you, you long for it to be gone. You long for a different reality to be there. But you don't know how to begin to make that happen. And so it just becomes like a wish. I wish things were different. I wish things were better. The people that Isaiah is writing to in that familiar passage about what the world is going to be like, the mountain of the Lord, Zion, the temple, the place where God is most intensely present in the world, is actually going to be the center of the world. People are going to stream from north and south and east and west to come and learn on the mountain of the Lord. That's the vision that Isaiah is sharing with these people in the 7th or 8th century BC, 28 centuries ago. It wasn't the real world in which those people were living. Assyria, the big empire, and they were thugs. I mean, they were really awful. They were kind of growing in their power. They were growing in their influence, and they were growing in their rapaciousness in terms of conquest and pillage. Judah and Israel are 2 separate kingdoms with a common culture and religion between them. Israel and the Syrian country are talking about a military alliance to stand against the Assyrians. And they're trying to get Judah to kind of come in on this alliance. And the king of Judah turns to Isaiah and asks him, "What shall I do?" And his response to that is, there is a different reality that God intends for you than this political military reality that is on the horizon. You're better off trusting the plan that God has for your world than you are trusting in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Syria. If you can picture a map of the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where Lebanon and Israel are, and Egypt is down a little bit here in the lower right-hand corner, and where Turkey is in the upper left-hand corner. If you live in that corridor along the coast of the Mediterranean, with this huge impenetrable desert to the east and this large sea to the left, and it's a fairly narrow corridor of a place where you can live. And then you have this giant kingdom, always powerful, for thousands of years always powerful, Egypt to the south. And then a string of huge, powerful empires to the north. You are the highway by which whoever's in the north gets to fight with the Egyptians. And if you're the Egyptians, then that's the highway that you use to get north. So that's where Judah is. That's where Israel is. They live in the middle of the highway by which the bullies get together to fight each other. It's like being perpetually, for hundreds of years, roadkill. So the notion that the world could contain peace for you is a very crazy notion, and yet the anxiety, which is ongoing for century after century, that somebody is going to try to get through you to somebody else, is a perpetual anxiety. And what do you do about it? And Isaiah's answer is, that future that future is in God's hands. God has a vision for what the future is going to look like, what the world is intended to be like. It's a place where people make war no more. A world in which nations will not make war against nations. Where nations will beat their swords and turn them into useful implements for farming and for tending orchards and vineyards. It's a world in which each person will sit contented beneath their vine and fig tree, to use another prophetic image. It's a world where the mountain of the Lord will be the center of the world, and everybody will be marching through, but not to make war, but rather to come and to hear and to learn and to see what God has in store. It will be a place where the lion will lie down with the lamb. A place where the child will play over the hole of the poisonous serpent and not be harmed. It's a place of security, a place of safety, a place of peace, a place of justice. And this apparently was a compelling image because it's not just Isaiah who includes it in his prophecy, but Micah also, almost word for word. So it was an image that was current in the culture, a thing for which they were longing, a thing for which they were hungering, a thing for which they were lusting. They wanted it with their whole mind, their whole spirit, their whole bodies. This season of Advent is about that longing. It's about that wanting. It's about that hungering and that lusting after the peaceful image of reality for human beings. The fact is that it's still big. It's still far away. 28 centuries later, the world is no more like that vision than it was for the Judeans living in the shadow of the Assyrians. And that shadow faded away, other shadows rose up to replace it. And again through the cycles of history. But still, this image lies before them. And Isaiah's point is, and it's one that we need to take to heart, and it's what this season of Advent is all about, is to keep in mind that the coming to reality of that peaceful time, that peaceful vision, is not something that we can accomplish. It is a thing which God will accomplish. It is a thing which is in God's hands. In a sense, that's what Isaiah is telling to the king of Judah. He's saying, look, you're anxious about Assyria. You're anxious about what's going to happen. You're anxious about the political and the military and the geopolitical situation. He said, but remember, the future is in God's hands. And you need to trust in God. And as we watch our news programs here during this time, we need to remember that also. Because I don't know about you, but when I read the newspaper or watch the television, I get all anxious. I get all frustrated. I get all angry at how the stupid things that people are doing that seem to be making it worse, and all the smart things that they're not doing that could make it better. But I get frustrated because it's a big problem and I'm a small person and I don't have a lot of power or interest. So I don't know whether you have that experience, but if you watch the news, you find yourself getting frightened. You find yourself getting frustrated. You find yourself getting anxious. And you might also find yourself getting powerless, getting paralyzed. It's too big. I don't know what's the first thing. I don't know how to start. The first thing is to do what Isaiah does, and that is to remember that the future is in God's hands. And the reason that we do that is to control our anxiety, to tame our fear, to put aside and put to rest our frustration. Because those are the things which paralyze us: fear and anxiety and frustration. Those are the reasons why Carol and I didn't get to these jobs. Those are the reasons that we don't do the things we could do to live into the reality that God intends for humanity. Fear, anxiety. So the first thing is to remember the future, the end of the story, is in God's hands, not in yours. Paul gives us a clue as to what the next steps might be. He kind of gives a really brilliant synopsis of the law, which is very much in line with what Jesus taught during his human mortal ministry. He says, all of the things in the Ten Commandments and all the other laws, when you boil away the extraneous stuff, when you reduce it to its essence, here it is: love. God is love. And when you boil away all of the legalisms and all of the morals and all of the ethics, when you boil it down to its essence, here it is: love one another. Treat one another the way that you would like to be treated. Love one another. This is the way in which we live as faithful servants of God, as faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. We do it by loving God. And then he moves into that part 11 to 14, which was our original reading for today. And the two things are connected, which is why I decided to add those few verses on the front. He said, because you know that the night is far gone. You know that we are much closer to God's accomplishment of his vision than we were when we first believed. Now, granted, that's still 19 centuries ago. But we're closer. We know that this reality is coming. So live not as people living in the darkness, with drunkenness and debauchery and licentiousness and quarreling and mean-spiritedness. Don't live in the world of the darkness. Don't live in the world of the big, impenetrable problems that you don't know where to start. He said, start by living in the light. Put on the armor of God, he says. The image that he's using is like somebody who's in bed at night. And there's that moment, that time in the night. It's like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes you wake up worried and afraid. And morning is almost there, but not yet there. That's the image that Paul is bringing forward for us to think about this. The night is far gone. It's almost morning. It's not morning yet. And what he's saying is, get up. Get up and get dressed. Put on the righteousness of God. Put on the whole armor of God. And he just told you what that was in the passage before. Love one another. The whole of the law and all of ethics and morality is boiled down to this: love one another. It's the first step. It's the first thing to moving against the darkness. Get up and start living like it's already light. Get up and live on the mountain of the Lord. Live as though you are a lion lying down with a lamb. Live with the courage of being a lamb and lying down with the lions. Live into the reality which is in God's hands to provide. That's what this Advent time is about. We long and lust and hunger for peace on earth and mercy mild. We don't know how to get started. We get started by living into the light. Start with little things. If you're still going to watch the news and read the newspaper through this Advent time, do this. Monitor yourself. Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling powerless and frustrated? And use the news as an opportunity to begin to adjust your reality. Use it as an opportunity to adjust the way you are in the world. Turn off the news and pray about the thing that is making you anxious. If you've seen something on the news that makes you really angry about something that somebody else is doing, turn off the news and pray for that person. Or pray for that group of people. Pray for their well-being, for their growth, for their changing. Pray. Start out by slaying the demons of fear, anxiety, and frustration. Begin somewhere. Find the place that you are already at work in the world against intractable problems like hunger and injustice. Are you already doing one thing? Are you bringing one box of cereal to the food kitchen every week? Start bringing two. And a can of meat to go with it, or some tuna, or some peanut butter. Are you already giving money to loaves and fishes? Volunteer to help and do some sweat equity. Figure out where you are and take the first step. Because while the future that God has in mind is in God's hands, and God will accomplish it, we won't. That does not mean that we're going to sit on our hands. We take the first step and we do what Paul suggests. We start putting on our clothes and start living in the darkness as though it were already light. We lean into the future that God intends for us, and we leave its resolution to God. Thanks be to God. Let us now bring before God our lives and the fruits of our lives, that they might be blessed and dedicated to God's service.